Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to make a case for what I think is the best Beatles album. Not all of you are going to agree, but of course that's okay, and we all have our favourites. And I was going to say before I begin, I could probably make a case for any album, Rubber Soul onwards, to be the best, and maybe even A Hard Day's Night if I'm pushed. I could make a case for all of those albums, but if I was in a court of law trying to argue the case, this is the one I would choose to defend, I think. And it's for many reasons. One of them probably because it was the first one I bought back, I can't remember exactly when. It was the summer of 78, I think, or maybe the autumn of 78, in a shop in Rugby. Not the normal record shop I used to go to, Berwick's, but another record shop whose name I've forgotten. And I remember just getting it home and just trying to absorb it. 30 tracks, more than 90 minutes of music, a lot to take in. Obviously the packaging was great, came with the poster with the lyrics on the back and the 4 beautiful colour cards of the Beatles. And so, yeah, I just fell in love with it pretty much immediately, as I did with all of the Beatles albums. And this is probably the album I play the most, along with Let It Be, actually, funnily enough. Those two are probably the ones I reach for the most. Abbey Road is probably the third one in terms of the ones I play the most, and then the others would sort of come somewhere further down the list. But that's not to say they're not all brilliant albums, because we're talking about the Beatles after all, aren't we? So I think first thing I'll say about this album is it's incredibly eclectic in its sort of mastery of different styles, from rock and roll to blues to vaudeville to the ballads on here. A lot of this album was inspired by the 3 months that the Beatles spent in India at Rishikesh. Well, it was slightly less than 6 months, 3 months for Paul and Ringo, but John and George stayed for 3 months. And anyway, they just had nothing but acoustic guitars out there in terms of instruments. So along with Donovan, who was also there, they strummed along and they wrote a ton of songs, not all of which particularly have anything to do with their experience of the Maharishi, as we'll see, but incredibly prolific. Not that they hadn't been prolific in 67 and 66, because they had been. But if one just takes the year 1968 alone and has the 30 tracks from this album, plus Lady Madonna and Inner Light is 32, plus Hey Jude and Revolution, the single versions, 34, and then Across the Universe and Hey Bulldog were also recorded in this year. So 36, I think I'm right in saying, is about the most prolific year of their whole career, including even 1964 when they released Hard Day's Night and Beatles for Sale, and also 65 when they released Help and Rubber Soul. I think if you counted up the number of Lennon-McCartney tracks, I think 68 is going to win. I haven't done the maths, but I think I'm right in saying that's the case, unless you include the Let It Be, all the tracks recorded, snippets of that. Well, I suppose 69 might win, but in terms of finished tracks, I think 68 would win. To me, this is the last album which would see all 4 Beatles really with their heart and soul poured into it, even though there were tensions during the making of this album. It's plain to see that John, Paul and George were really pushing the envelope in terms of songwriting, whereas on Abbey Road it was slightly reluctant contributions from John, although his contributions are brilliant on Abbey Road. He was a little bit overshadowed by Paul's stuff on that album, just a little bit, not much. But on this album, I think I counted them up, and George does 4 songs. Ringo sings the lead on 2, although he didn't write Good Night, which leaves the remaining 24 songs divided equally between John and Paul. So there's everything on this album to please whatever taste you have, and I suppose that's one of the things where some people would say, yeah, I like bits of it but not other bits because I don't like the style of this song or that song. But if you're into the Beatles, if you're into like McCartney, Lennon, Harrison and their songwriting, you're going to love this album. If you're one of these people who tends to prefer Lennon, then you maybe would steer clear of some of the McCartney tracks on here, but I'm just guessing. If you ask me whether this is a better album, the White Album, just show it to you in case you're not familiar. This is my mono copy with all the goodies inside, and it opens from the top with the black sleeves. I'm not going to show it to you because it's a little bit precious. I want to keep it in mint condition. I'll show you a few other copies I have of it later. But yeah, so it's got stone cold classics like Back in USSR, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and I would say Obla Di, Obla Da. Those are the three tracks which made it onto the Blue Album. There's an awful lot of deep cuts here which pretty much remain unknown outside the fan bases of the Beatles. So in terms of songs getting played on the radio or featuring in compilations, you won't see Savoy Truffle or Sexy Sadie or Everybody's Got Something to Hide except for Me and My Monkey. And it's not because they're bad tracks or anything, it's just because they weren't perhaps single material, or they maybe weren't too commercial. And there's this argument going around, which I don't agree with, that it should have been a single. I think it's the most ludicrous argument under the sun. And George Martin, who's one of the people who said it, has never bitten a bullet and said which songs he would leave out. I mean, there's only a couple which you could even conceivably leave out, in my opinion, and that would be Wild Honey Pie and Revolution 9. But having said that, you wouldn't have the White Album without anything on it, because it's sequenced so bloody brilliantly. I mean, they spent 24 hours working out the sequence sometime in October '68. John, Paul and George Martin staying up all night until they drove themselves mad. And it really, their efforts really paid off, because I'll come to an example of the sequencing in a bit later on. But Back to Basics was the other thing one could say about this album. So sort of not too much sort of psychedelic influence anymore. No backwards guitars. Yes, there is orchestration, but it's relatively muted and not sort of overpowering like it was on some of the other Beatles releases. So Back to Basics, taking the lead from Bob Dylan in January '68 with John Wesley Harding, when he said, "Okay, forget psychedelia. This is where I'm at," and it was just acoustic bass, drums, and Bob singing, nothing else. Bit of harmonica, and the Stones did the same with Beggar's Banquet, which probably would have come out before the White Album had it not been for the controversy over the sleeve. And because of the delay that caused, Beggar's Banquet came out after the White Album with a very similar looking cover, and so everyone was saying, oh, they're copying the Beatles. But in actual fact, the Stones were going back to basics, if anything, before the Beatles, with Beggar's Banquet. It's a very acoustic driven album. The Beach Boys were doing similar stuff in '68 as well. So it's got an absolute plethora of brilliant ballads on this album. From Paul, you've got Blackbird and Mother Nature's Son and I Will, three of his most beautiful, haunting melodies with great lyrics to go with that. And John coming up with Julia, which is absolutely sensational song about his mother with a bit of Yoko thrown in as well. And you've got comments on politics. Well, I mentioned Blackbird. That was a comment on the civil rights movement, sort of oblique reference to that at the time, and then comments on gun control. The Happiness is a Warm Gun, sort of satirical song about gun control, because it was inspired by a gun magazine which George Martin brought into the studio, and the headline on the whole magazine, the front cover, was Happiness is a Warm Gun. So John thought this was so insane, he created a song. But of course, at that time is with Yoko, and he was using double entendre, so Happiness is a Warm Gun became sort of a sexual reference as well. So quite a bit of double entendre from John at this time. What else can we say? George Martin basically left the sessions halfway through and went on holiday because the Beatles were bickering. Jeff Emerick left the sessions during the middle as well, saying this is not fun anymore. And in his book, he quite categorically says the White Album is his least favourite Beatles album. Well, he's entitled to his opinion, of course. Talk about other deep cuts which nobody knows outside the fan book hardly. Glass Onion, Happiness as a Warm Gun, relatively unknown track. Everybody's Got Something to Hide, raucous rocker, which was inspired by the Maharishi. That's what he used to say in his lectures. Everybody's got something to hide, so but don't hide anything. Let it out. And sorry, I think it wasn't the title of that song Maharishi used to say. It was more, "Come on, it's such a joy. Come on and take it easy." I think that was what he was saying more than the title. And Lennon just took the title because it sounded good. And Sexy Sadie was a reference to Maharishi allegedly making a pass at Mia Farrow. The evidence was very thin, but anyway, it makes for a sensational song. And quite a bit of tension, as we said, amongst the four Beatles as they were making the album. I was reading then, I think Paul was sort of working on Mother Nature's Son in the studio, and John and Ringo walked in, and suddenly the atmosphere went from being good to being very tense. And I think it's Ken Scott said you could cut the atmosphere with a knife. And then the John and Ringo left, and then the atmosphere returned to normal and good spirits again. So that was quite interesting. Yoko was obviously present in the studio during most of these sessions. That must have caused some tension. But as I say, on the whole, I think the Beatles regard this as one of their greatest achievements. Ringo says, okay, maybe we should put it out as two albums, the White and the Whiter album, but he doesn't make the case for a single album. He just thinks there's a lot of information on a double album to take in, and he says he loves the White Album because they were back to being more of a band. And if you read some of the comments about the White Album, it's, there was just John with a backing group, Paul with a backing group, George with a backing group. I think that does a disservice to the other members of the band backing up the respective songs of the other members, because George's guitar throughout Lennon's songs, particularly on Sexy Sadie and Happiness is a Warm Gun, is very empathetic to what John was trying to say at the time, and Paul, as we've said before, contributes wonderful piano on Sexy Sadie, and John lifts Obla Dee to the next level, but with the pounding piano, which sort of makes the song more energetic and less plodding, like it was in the earlier takes. So a lot of I know I read that only 16 songs feature all four Beatles. Well, I wouldn't get into that because, that was not unprecedented. Yesterday from Help album only featured Paul, for example. Eleanor Rigby only featured Paul in terms of vocal, and no Beatle playing any instrument on that. It was just all strings. So anyway, and I don't think it sort of detracts from the overall album, the fact that not all the four Beatles are playing on every track. People have said it's a bit too satirical, and it's a parody of various different styles. I would say that's not true. I think it's more of a master of different styles, and to use the phrase jack of all trades, I think the Beatles demonstrated this on this album, and some critics were saying, these satirical songs are irrelevant to the times and they're apolitical because they weren't coming out and fighting for the radical left who were calling for revolution. But if you look at the song Revolution, it was an answer to that leftist feeling at the time. We all want to see the plan, but when you talk about destruction, you can count me out. I know he said "in" on the album, but for the most part in Lennon's life, he was against violence and saying, don't smash it all down, because then what are you going to do? How are you going to rebuild it? So I think Revolution is a political song. I know the far left at the time dismissed it as being weak and not supporting the movements, but I think there's a lot of hidden depth and long-lasting meaning in the lyrics, which could be appropriate even today, actually. And of course, Revolution 9 is a pretty scary soundscape of what a revolution might sound like, with all the screaming and the guns and take this, brother, may it serve you well, and all that. So I just think, Revolution is wonderful. I'm sort of skitting around a bit from here to there, but I've got some other double albums in my collection which I love, like Tusk and Goodbye Yellow Brick Road and Exile on Main Street, which I got into not too long after I got into this album. But I think there's nothing to compare the White Album in terms of the depth of songs, the variety, and just the brilliance on offer from John, Paul and George. And Ringo contributes his first song, Don't Pass Me By, which is not the strongest track on the album, but it's quite fun. I think it was the band said it was their favourite track on the album. And then Ringo sings a lovely song, Goodnight, to end the album, and I'll come to that when I go through the side 4 sequencing in a minute. If this was a political statement, it would be a manifesto of everything, really. It just concludes everything. But musically speaking, I think it presents a colourful palette of everything they had to offer. And I don't think it slips into parody, maybe occasionally, but on the whole, it's just showing, you want me to play a sort of vaudeville type song? Sure, I can do it with Martha My Dear. Effortless piano from Paul. Not easy to play on the piano. I've tried it, failed. Well, you want me to do the most beautiful ballad of all time? Sure, I'll do it. Blackbird. A lovely, energetic rocker on side 1, Glass Onion. I think George is on record saying that he only plays, soon after the release of the album, he was interviewed and he said he only plays side 1. So I guess it is a long album. It's more than 90 minutes. If you've ever tried to tape it onto a C90 cassette, it's more than 90 minutes. It doesn't fit. And it's a lot to take in. So George tended to play side 1, which was probably the most commercial side of the record, with Back in USSR, Opla D and While My Guitar all on that side. And then he sort of gave up after that. And Paul says, I'm not a great one for saying it should have been a single album. It's great, it's sold, it's the bloody Beatles White Album, shut up. I think it was probably Paul's best line from the anthology out of all the interviews he did. As I said, Ringo said it should have been 2 separate albums. Philip Norman is on record saying John didn't like Paul's songs and Paul didn't like John's songs. Well, that's garbage, because John may not have liked Birthday, and he may not have liked Honey Pie, but he had good things to say about Blackbird. He admitted that Mother Nature's Son was preferred to Child of Nature because they were too similar and one of them had to survive. He is on record saying there's a lot of good stuff on the album, not just my songs. So I think, and Back in USSR, I think John absolutely loved that song. And he said very proudly that he and George played bass on that song, and he went boom, 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 and then try putting that in your typewriter, he said to David Sheff of Playboy in 1980. At the time, there were some reviews, mostly favourable, but Nick Cohn, I think I've pronounced his name right, or Cohn, New York Times, unbelievably gave it an unfavourable review, although Richard Goldstein in the same newspaper gave it a favourable review, so I'm glad they printed 2, not just the 1. But Jacob Stolworthy from The Independent took the task of ranking all the 30 songs. I just read his ranking. Quite interesting, because some of the sort of lesser known tracks are near the top. Happiness is a Warm Gun was number 2, for example, so I quite enjoyed that ranking. What else am I going to say? Yeah, when the album came out, literally at the time it was released, my favourite Doctor Who story was being shown on TV, Doctor Who and the Invasion of the Cybermen, with Kevin Stoney in the leading role as the baddie against the Doctor, and it's just a brilliant... And so I like to think the Beatles completed the White Album, went home and watched the Cybermen on TV, but they probably didn't, but anyway. So I'm going to talk about the sequencing. I mentioned it earlier, the sequencing of this album, and I just take side 4 as an example, because it starts off with Revolution. Although it's not the rocky version, it is in the true sense of the word the heavier version of the 2, where you can really hear the words, and he says he can count me out in, he's not sure, and it's a spooky version of the song and less commercial than the single. John wanted it to be a single, the others said it's too slow, which may be the case for a single, but it's a wonderful way to start side 4. And then kind of antidote to that is, okay, that's depressed you a bit, so we'll have Honey Pie, where Paul's kind of doing a light-hearted song with a lovely melody, and then followed by George Harrison with his sarcastic Savoy Truffle, almost saying, I know he's talking about Eric Clapton's Sweet Tooth, but he could be talking to Paul when he says, you know that what you eat you are, but what is sweet now turns so sour. We all know obla-dee bla-da, but can you tell me where you are? So that could be read as aimed at Paul. I'm pretty sure it might have been partly, but in a sort of joking kind of way. And then after that, you've got a very spooky song from John with Cry Baby Cry. Can Can You Take Me Back to Where I Came From Paul right at the end, and just a very haunting song. And that Can You Take Me Back to Where I Came From leads nicely into Revolution 9, which is a scary sort of nearly 10 minutes of what it would be like for a revolution, and then so that's going to put you in a pretty dark mood. And then to finish it off, perfect really, because you've got Ringo singing this lovely lullaby, which I think is a perfect antidote to Revolution 9. So I think the sequencing works really well on side 4, and the whole way through the album. I love the way on side 2 they just decided to put all the animal tracks on one side: Rocky Raccoon, Piggies, Blackbird. I'm probably missing one other, but so that was that. I was going to show you a couple of versions. This is my Yugoslav press. With what's interesting about this is the mirrored pictures. So these are the other way around from what you're used to, which I thought was very interesting. And so I picked up a copy of this a couple of years ago here in Budapest, and so that's my Yugoslav. I've got a Russian copy here, which is an unofficial copy from 1991, but still very interesting to see, because there's no photos here. It's actually paintings or drawings of the photos, and then the track listing in Russian, which I found very interesting. It's not actually on the Apple label, and it doesn't come with the poster or the cards, but various albums, various versions on the CD. This is the mono one from the mono box. This was the 2009 CD with, it doesn't come with the cards, but it quite nicely puts the 4 pictures there side by side. And that comes with the poster. The new version quite daringly puts the alternative photos on the inside there. And then what I want to show you is the 30th anniversary. This is the first sort of true replica of the original packaging from 1998. Not only does it come with the 4 cards, but it also replicates the black inner sleeves, and even with the apple in the middle, which I thought was a very nice touch, and it does it even with the second disc as well. And that comes with the poster as well. So I picked that up quite cheap in Hungary. So I like to have all these different versions. My original UK copy is signed by Yoko Ono back here in Budapest in 1998. I haven't got that to show you here, but yeah, I'm always on the lookout for picking up different copies of the White Album. I prefer if they're complete with the poster and the pictures, otherwise I wouldn't bother. But with the Russian one, I thought, well, it's sufficiently interesting, and although the Yugoslav one doesn't come with the poster, it's just very interesting to see the pictures with the wrong way around, so to speak. So just to round off, where were we? I have some notes at the end here to show you. Okay. Yeah. So I guess a lot of you are going to say Sgt. Pepper was the best album, or a lot of you are going to say Revolver was the best album. I understand you completely. That's fine. It's all subjective. It's up to which you prefer, which was the first one you bought, etc., etc. As I say, I could make a case for any number of albums from the Beatles being their top one, but this is probably the one closest to my heart. And if push comes to shove, I had to take one to a desert island, it would be this one, simply because it's twice the length of any other Beatles album, so you get twice the value for money. And so this was, in my opinion, a timeless album, and thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.